Welcome to Abraham Lincoln in New York, a rail splitter bicentennial celebration.
February 12, 2009 marked the bicentennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth. The great emancipator remains equal in estimation to just one other president, George Washington. How appropriate to celebrate the life of our 16th president at the site where our first took his oath of office back in 1789, Federal Hall in New York City.
Here on the first floor in the rotunda, we greet groups and visitors before taking them upstairs to show them the exhibit. You can't extricate Lincoln from the Civil War. He was our commander-in-chief, a wartime president, but this is more about Lincoln the man. That being said, we greet people here with the accoutrements of war, a photograph that shows Lincoln in the field as commander at the camp in Antietam. We're really pleased to exhibit this letter written by Abraham Lincoln in response to the 1864 slaughter of captured black Union soldiers at Fort Pillow, Tennessee. Those around Lincoln demanded retribution. Here Lincoln writes his response, "As blood cannot restore blood, government should not act for revenge." Interestingly, he never signed the letter, never sent it, deciding it prudent to simply let the matter rest.
The Rail Splitter, a national organization of Lincoln collectors and scholars, hosted an exhibit of authentic period Lincoln memorabilia on display from February to June 2009.
This is an original program to the dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery. You have to remember that when Lincoln gave this magnificent, very short address, all people at the time remember is that he got up, spoke for a minute and a half, and sat down. It wasn't until it was published in the newspapers the day later that the brilliance of this very brief oration was appreciated. So we have to believe very few of these programs remain extant. Something that I'm really proud to start the exhibit with, just as a graphic, is this wonderful broadside. It had never before been seen. It's a 3-sheet. You'll notice the registration lines where it was pieced together in 3 separate components. This is a 19th century poster that adorned New York City's Republican headquarters in 1864. It includes all the coattail candidates running for office in New York State and New York City.
The exhibit showcased unique treasures of American history, most never before seen in public, to document Lincoln's life and times. Original photographs, manuscripts, ephemera, and a wide and colorful assortment of political artifacts illustrate how the image of Lincoln was shaped for the national stage and the role New York played. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky in 1809. His father, Thomas, owned land and worked as a farmer, carpenter, and cabinet maker. Land title difficulties and a distaste for slavery led him to move the family to Indiana when Abraham was 7. They moved to Illinois in 1830. Lincoln studied law informally and was admitted to the bar in 1836. This is his survey of Springfield, and this is his patent. Lincoln is the only president to hold one. These documents and keys are from his life as a successful lawyer, representing clients from indigent widows to railroads. The exhibit continues documenting Lincoln's early life with a case displaying Lincoln's use of words.
As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This is my idea of democracy. To differ from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy.
In 1842, articles in a local paper caused James Shields to challenge Lincoln to a duel.
Lincoln, of course, did not want to fight a duel, but as the challenge party, Lincoln chose as the weapon to fight the duel cavalry broadswords, which, if you think about it, meant that Abraham Lincoln, 6'4", long arms, would basically be able to end any sort of duel before it even started. It was ridiculous. It gave Lincoln such a distinct advantage. No sane person would fight the duel. Their seconds came together and reached an accord. Lincoln took responsibility, and the duel was called off.
These documents chronicle Lincoln's early political career. He lost election after election, but did serve one term in Congress. As a member of the House of Representatives, Lincoln was appointed to various committees and was a manager of Zachary Taylor's 1849 inaugural ball.
The first big campaign that put Lincoln, I guess, more on the national stage, he was given more attention, was the campaign of 1858. A lot of people mistakenly think of the Lincoln-Douglas debates as having taken place during the 1860 presidential race. No, it was actually the Senate campaign of 1858. We always say that Lincoln won the debates but lost the election because, quite frankly, he advanced arguments that took him into 1860 and won the presidential election. This is a copy of the Lincoln-Douglas debates that were republished very much thanks to Lincoln keeping a scrapbook accounting for all the different debates, published as an 1860 campaign document and a tremendous bestseller. This document has never been published, never been seen, written to Illinois Governor Yates by William Herndon in 1856. Here he is, speaking of Lincoln as pretty much a political dullard. This is a portrait of Stephen Douglas that was inscribed and presented by Douglas the night before the first debate to the McCormicks. The people who ran the boarding house he lodged in the night before the first of the Lincoln-Douglas debates.
Despite experience as a political speaker, Abraham Lincoln was no doubt surprised in October 1859 when the Young Men's Republican Union of New York invited him to travel east and address them on any topic of his choosing for a fee of $200. This case shows the correspondence regarding this speech, where Lincoln argued that the Founding Fathers would not have supported the extension of slavery. The Cooper Union address was a great success and introduced him to the Eastern establishment as a man they could easily understand and support. A near-capacity crowd of 1,500 each paid 25 cents to attend. Lincoln became derisively known as the two-bit candidate. Seen here is the newspaper advertising the address and the only known ticket to it. On the morning Lincoln delivered his Cooper Union speech in New York City, he visited Matthew Brady's photographic gallery on Broadway and Bleecker. As Lincoln later said, "Mr. Brady and the Cooper Institute made me president."
This is a case that I'm really pleased to present because it tells an absolutely significant storyline for understanding Lincoln, the man. He was a political animal and understood the power of imagery.
Abraham Lincoln was the first president to be extensively photographed. Partly a result of his keen understanding of the power of publicity and imagery in politics, Lincoln's rise to fame coincided with photographic innovations that made it possible to widely distribute his likeness through that medium.
Prior to 1860, if you lived in most of this country, not only did you vote for somebody you never saw, never heard, but in all likelihood you never saw a likeness of. This letter is a wonderful piece. If you note, there's a small salt print photograph of Lincoln attached to the top of the letter. And Lincoln is writing to the person who sent him that photo that in fact it is a true photo from life. And he writes, I think a very true one, though my wife and many others do not. My impression is their objection arises from the disordered condition of the hair. We call that the tousled hair pose of Lincoln. This case, we begin to talk about going into the convention. In 1860, the Republican convention was held in a building called the Wigwam in Chicago, and Lincoln did not attend. He remained at home in Springfield, and he in fact directed those managing his campaign seeking the nomination not to make any promises, not to make any deals. This first group of correspondence was written by future Union General Nathaniel McLean, and he's writing about his father, who was a Supreme Court Justice, John McLean, and his father's chances of getting the nomination. This is a roll call of those at the National Republican Convention, state by state. This is the original galley proof of the printed platform that was adopted at that convention. And of course, containment of slavery was very much a component of that platform. This was then published in this decorative broadside that was given to those attending the convention.
Even if the election of 1860 had not precipitated the Civil War, it would still stand as one of the most exciting campaigns in our history. Ineptitude, corruption, and dissension in the pro-Southern administration of President Buchanan helped split the Democrats. The Republicans reacted by repudiating the most radical abolitionist elements in their party, nominating instead the Washington outsider, Abraham Lincoln.
These two booklets are very much reflective of the idea that all politics is local. One is the Constitution of the Lincoln Club of Sandwich. The other is the Constitution and bylaws of the Lincoln and Hamlin Club of Horsham.
Repeated calls for anti-Lincoln men to resolve their differences and unite were ignored. Only in New York City did voters have the opportunity to vote for an anti-Lincoln fusion ticket. Campaign biographies, speeches, and political tracts flooded the country. New York tunesmiths hammered out countless quick steps and polkas. Lincoln was celebrated as the rail splitter, a frontiersman born in a log cabin, a man of the people, honest old Abe. Such images, cleverly promoted through campaign paraphernalia, proved irresistible to voters. With his opposition split three ways, Lincoln's election was a foregone conclusion.
As of Woodrow Wilson's administration, it became illegal to print anything on an American flag, but it was common in the years 1840 through Wilson to emblazon the standard with the names of candidates and their likeness. We have a wonderful letter here from William Cullen Bryant, written to Lincoln, imploring him not to give a speech because of concern about the financial policies, shaking Wall Street and putting a collapse on the economic markets. This is the only known ticket to the Democratic Convention that year to remain extant. A couple of paper horns. What we have here are the campaign devices of their day. They would pin these to their lapels with straight pins. Until recently, it had been assumed all these ribbons were made in Boston, New York, or Philadelphia and sold to clubs around the country. In this printer's trade journal, we discovered an ad from James Conner and Sons of New York City selling the wood blocks for these ribbons, allowing local communities to embellish the artwork with their own slogans.
Political clubs were the lifeblood of a campaign, and they organized throughout the nation, crisscrossing the country on excursion trains. The most ambitious of these was the Hartford, Connecticut Wideawakes, organized in March 1860. Chapters spread like wildfire across the North, lending color and liveliness to the campaign. Their avowed purpose was to promote the election of Republican candidates and assure their security. They carried torches in their parades, while the captain of each chapter carried a red glass lantern. Their quasi-military appeal brought in many recruits.
These are 3 campaign torches. They are hollow wells that would be filled with oil, and the wicks would be lit on fire. They basically represented pageantry, but also danger. If you can imagine, these torches would swing and flaming oil would come spilling out. So marchers would have to wear special uniforms, slickers, and kepis to protect themselves from getting burned.
Once Lincoln was nominated, the Wideawakes campaigned constantly. Opponents tried to emulate them, but the Breckinridge Minutemen and Douglas Invincibles paled by comparison. In 1860, the New York Herald estimated the total number of drilled and uniformed Wideawakes at more than 400,000.
This split rail fence, a real folk art parade display item, was carved by a boy in Kinderhook, New York, too young to vote but wanted to march beside his father in a parade. Likewise, this oversized axe was carried in campaign rallies. This is the only known salesman's sheet advertising for parade equipment for sale during the 1860 campaign.
Months elapsed from Lincoln's election in November 1860 until his inauguration on March 4, 1861.
After Lincoln's election, he was deluged with correspondence. We have letters to Lincoln from William Cullen Bryant, advice to Lincoln from Horace Greeley as he plans to take office. These are evocative items called hot stove letters. Lincoln is preparing for the trip and packing up his law office. One day he goes down to the cabinet maker that occupies space below his law office and is carrying a big sheath of papers, and he's about to pitch them into the furnace. The cabinet maker says, "What are these?" And Lincoln just says, "Some of the letters I've received," and the cabinet maker says, "May I keep them?" Thank goodness for the cabinet maker and for history that these, what we call hot stove letters, weren't destroyed. These are 3 death threats Lincoln received after the election Lincoln had VIPs and local dignitaries join the inaugural train as they went across the country to the inauguration. Just as Lincoln received death threats, he received simple requests for his autograph, and his secretary drafted this letter from Springfield. This is an inaugural ball dance card from 1861. By the time Lincoln reaches Washington for the inauguration, the secession crisis is underway. The ball was renamed the Union Ball, and Mary Lincoln was serenaded by the Marine Corps Band with a new tune they composed, the Union March. Here are examples of content letters, correspondence with insight by witnesses to history. One letter is from a man wondering what is happening to the price of Negroes with Lincoln's election, considering selling his blacks before the market crashes. Another letter is from the gunsmith Samuel Colt discussing support for Stephen Douglas. And here we have a man sending a piece of an actual rail split by Lincoln, a souvenir sent home to Connecticut just 1 month before the election. A big part of what we're talking about is how New York helped package Lincoln. New York very much played an integral role in getting Lincoln elected. And these courier cartoons, these campaign newspapers, these campaign biographies, all this ephemera came out of New York printing houses.
The Rail Splitter, published in Chicago, was a campaign newspaper that took Lincoln's moniker for their masthead. Political tokens, medals, and ferrotypes were the campaign buttons of the 19th century.
Campaign biographies weren't restricted to the more traditional publishers. Here we've got a monthly astrological journal that predicted the likely candidacy of the different candidates by their star charts. We even have a phrenological journal postulating that Lincoln was not too presidential by the shape of his head. It's hard for people in this day and age to conceive, but candidates enjoyed popular support from groups that would stand on corners or gather to sing songs written about the person they were endorsing. These are songsters, song sheets, sheet music. Of course, another side of the political game was negative politics. In 1860, Stephen Douglas made this pronouncement that he was taking time off from the campaign to go back home to visit his mother. The entire trip home was occasioned by his making stops and making stump speeches. So the Republicans lampooned him with this wonderful broadside, chiding him as a little boy lost in search of his mother, been seen at clam bakes and been seen giving talks on some subject he calls popular sovereignty. He is about 5 feet nothing in height and about the same in diameter, and has a red face, short legs, and a large belly. Unfortunately, negative politics embraced the race card of its day. Miscegenation, the word meaning a mixing of the races, was created during the Lincoln campaign. And here we've got examples of what we call slinging the mud. There's a cart photograph of a Lincoln actor dressed up to represent the president, leaned over a table drunk with a bottle of whiskey on it. Lincoln, of course, was a teetotaler, but I'm certain it had its effect. Those are two phony law office cards with rather negative language, lampooning Lincoln, the lawyer. And there's a card there showing Lincoln as a baboon. This is a biography, Abraham Africanus I.
The exhibit includes a display of delicate 19th century political and patriotic china. Many utilitarian objects adorned with images of the president, political opponents, and military leaders were produced during Lincoln's term of office. These include pill, sewing, and snuff boxes, match safes, mugs, plates, and vases. The Lincolns left Springfield on February 11, 1861, though they maintained a presence in the state capitol. When they went to Washington, of necessity, a lot was left behind, including their dog Fido. Accompanied by their 2 young children, they moved into the White House. During most of the Lincoln administration, their oldest son Robert attended Harvard University, class of 1864, while his 2 young siblings amused themselves with all sorts of adventures around the White House, from caring for a virtual zoo of pets to playing soldier with custom uniforms and setting up encampments on the grounds. Here is a note from Lincoln: "Let Tad have some boards if it is convenient," authorizing the official carpenter to allow Tad to build the doghouse. Mary was widely criticized for her extravagant spending. This is a piece of the Limoges china pattern she ordered.
Everyday correspondence from people who visited and met the Lincolns. Wonderful content. One saying Lincoln isn't nearly as ugly as the press represented him as being.
Correspondence and photos illustrate life in the White House. A letter to Gideon Wells describes Mary as an embarrassment. Other letters document visitor impressions. This dinner invitation was sent to General David Hunter. These are photos of cabinet members, the team of rivals. The Lincolns planned to return to Springfield after leaving office and had left some of their things packed in this trunk, known as the Grimsley trunk. Renowned sculptor Leonard Volk cast Lincoln's hands from life. The United States was a perpetual work in progress, from its inception through the Civil War. South Carolina threatened several times to secede, but it was Lincoln's election that finally tipped the balance. South Carolina seceded in December 1860, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Eventually, they formed the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi was chosen provisional president. After listening to the best military advice, Lincoln ordered supplies sent to Fort Sumter, an action that resulted in the outbreak of war.
This is the only known correspondence between Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, a letter both signed early in the war, July of 1861, discussing how to handle POWs. These are the dividers, the compass that Lincoln used every day in the telegraph office as he recorded and mapped the movements of troops in the field as dispatches were received.
The Emancipation Proclamation, one of President Lincoln's greatest achievements, was also his most controversial act. No sooner had war commenced than abolitionists and radical Republicans urged him to free the slaves and accept African Americans into the Army.
Here we've got a petition sent by members of the First Congregation Church of Williamsburg here in New York, imploring Lincoln to abolish slavery. We have a letter written by Theodore Tilton talking about a meeting of those in Brooklyn, imploring Lincoln to recruit blacks into service. This is one of the real treasures of the exhibit, Lincoln's 1841 letter to Mary Speed. Piloted a flatboat down the Mississippi and wrote of seeing slaves in shackles. The image of families, men, women, children, forever separated from each other, left a lasting mark. Lincoln later wrote, "As I would not be a slave, I would not be a master."
The three gentlemen who will hand you this note belong to an artillery company at Baltimore who wish to get into the United States service. Please give them an interview. After they explain their case, if you advise it, I will receive them. I hate to reject any offered from what is called a Southern state.
Slavery could only be abolished nationally by constitutional amendment, which did happen once the country was reunited. In the meantime, under the doctrine of military necessity, as commander-in-chief, Lincoln decided to do what was within his power: declare all slaves free who remained within rebel territory. Not wanting to be seen as acting out of desperation, Lincoln waited until after the Union victory at Antietam to draft his proclamation.
This letter was written by Abraham Lincoln to the governor of Louisiana, Michael Hahn.
I congratulate you on having fixed your name in history as the first free state governor of Louisiana. Now you are about to have a convention which, among other things, will probably define the elective franchise. I barely suggest for your private consideration whether some of the colored people may not be let in. As for instance, the very intelligent, and especially those who fought gallantly in our ranks. They would probably help in some trying time to come to keep the jewel of liberty within the family of freedom. But this is only a suggestion, not to the public, but to you alone.
Lincoln quietly is trying to begin chipping away at the evil of slavery, and the idea of giving blacks the franchise was a radical move forward. Those are two of the first printings of the Emancipation Proclamation. They were issued in these little booklets to be sent to commanders in the field such that it could be communicated throughout the Army. This letter has Lincoln donating the original Emancipation Proclamation to the ladies of the Northwestern Sanitary Fair to be sold in support of their efforts to provide for wounded soldiers.
The New York City draft riots began July 13, 1863, and ended 3 days later. These violent uprisings were in response to the first Federal Conscription Act in America. The first draft lottery occurred on July 11, 1863, without incident. But on Monday the 13th, a crowd led by the Black Joke Fire Engine Company, number 33, attacked the 9th District Provost Marshal's office at 3rd Avenue and 47th Street, where the draft was taking place. Rioters at first targeted only military and government buildings and set the mayor's residence on 5th Avenue ablaze. Their attempt to attack the leading Republican newspaper, the New York Tribune, was thwarted by 3 Gatling guns manned by Tribune employees. This document describes the site of this exhibit, at the time a sub-treasury, being safe from rioters only because of a gunboat moored nearby.
These broadsides and similar examples were papered all over New York City in the wake of the draft riots. The agenda was really simple: to remind people what they were fighting for and who the real enemy was. This is a correspondence to Lincoln reporting on what's going on here in New York during the riots. We have Lincoln writing to John Jacob Astor. This is an original draft call Lincoln signed right after Gettysburg for drafting New Yorkers into the military. Lincoln was famous for telling jokes and bawdy stories. It was a point that his supporters loved. He was a man of the people. It was a point that those who attacked him would reflect on his crassness. It was a source of embarrassment at times to Mary Lincoln, but it became an 1864 campaign point that he was Old Abe the jokester. During the 1864 campaign, you have to remember that Abraham Lincoln did not think he stood a chance of getting reelected. People were weary of the war. They wanted change.
Some leading Republicans quietly sought to replace Lincoln with another candidate, but he was renominated at the National Union Party convention held in Baltimore. To attract support from war Democrats, the military governor of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, replaced Hannibal Hamlin on the ticket. The Democrats nominated the former commander of the Army of the Potomac, General George McClellan.
This is a defining piece of political propaganda, using race as the issue that would define both Republican and Democratic platforms. The beginning, election of McClellan, Pendleton Vice President, Vallandigham Secretary of War, armistice, fall of wages, no market for produce, Pennsylvania border state, invasion, civil war, anarchy, despotism, the end. A lot of people don't appreciate that 1864 was the first time soldiers could vote in an election. And soldiers' votes very much helped get Lincoln reelected. They voted overwhelmingly in support of the Republican candidate, despite the popularity of their former general, George McClellan. This letter is written by a soldier in camp talking about voting for Lincoln while on picket duty within sight of the enemy. This is the great New York editor Henry Raymond writing to Lincoln as to his prospects for re-election here in New York.
With the election only weeks away, Northern spirits were greatly buoyed when the Union Army captured the rebel stronghold of Atlanta. Voters, seeing that the end was not far distant, handed Lincoln an overwhelming victory.
This is the only extant 1865 inaugural ball dance card. The Chronicle Junior took their printing press and put it on top of a wagon that was pulled in the actual inaugural procession, in the parade itself. They printed up these programs as souvenirs and were selling them right off the back of the wagon. It's fun to point out that one of them got to Lincoln. It's at the Library of Congress. He's written on the outside of an inaugural program and signed it. Just as we are a nation of laws, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had to be ratified and passed by Congress. This is the original transmittal issue of the 13th Amendment, signed by Secretary of State William Seward. The 13th Amendment, of course, formally abolished slavery. Before we get to the actual assassination, of course, Lincoln was shot in a theater. We talk a little bit about the family that was so tied to that tragedy. Ironically, Lincoln wasn't murdered by just an anonymous lunatic. Whenever I bring groups of visitors through, I ask, who's the most famous actor of the day? And people call out names. And I always say, picture a combination of these celebrities going off to Washington to shoot the president. That's who you had with John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was one of the most celebrated actors of his day, a man of great renown for his stage performances. His older brother, Edwin Booth, remains perhaps considered by many the greatest Shakespearean actor to ever take the stage. These are playbills from John Wilkes Booth's performances. This first letter is John Wilkes Booth at the age of 17 talking about making his debut on the stage.
On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, essentially ending the Civil War. President and Mrs. Lincoln, now free to resume private life, took in an evening performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater on April 14th. There, the unthinkable happened. The president was mortally wounded by Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth.
We have a photograph of Ford's Theater as it looked at the time, and the veil Mary Lincoln wore to Ford's Theater that very evening. This is an admittance card to the first funeral that took place, the official funeral in Washington, D.C. This is a program for that funeral.
First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln decided her husband's remains should be taken home for burial in Springfield. A special funeral train, originally made to be the president's new official train, sadly never used in life, would retrace the route taken to Washington in 1861. The train carrying his body left Washington on April 21, 1865. It reached New York City on April 25th. New York's 7th Regiment, who answered Lincoln's first call for troops to protect the Capitol in 1861, escorted his remains to City Hall. More than 500,000 people stood in line to view Lincoln as he lay in state. 11,000 soldiers and 75,000 citizens marched in the funeral procession, which lasted almost 4 hours.
Just as we had an invitation to dine at the White House made out to David Hunter, this is David Hunter's pass to escort Lincoln's body back to Springfield. All these ribbons adorned everyone's shirt sleeve, everyone's lapel. These pulps, these dime novels, speak to the morbid fascination with the greatest tragedy by Victorians who bought them in huge numbers.
A vast manhunt for the actor and his fellow conspirators culminated in their death, capture, imprisonment, or execution.
These are photographs of the co-conspirators and examples of the first instance of photojournalism in this country. Alexander Garner's photographs documenting the hanging of the conspirators. Grief from Lincoln's death was worldwide and gives us perhaps the oddest item in this exhibit. This is an official resolution in New York City's Chamber of Commerce expressing condolences from the Bengal Chamber of Commerce in Calcutta. This letter, written by Mary Todd Lincoln 3 years after the assassination, still using black-bordered mourning stationery, she writes that her excessive grief over the loss of a husband whom I idolized and who was my fond lover when I was only a young schoolgirl, into the hour of his untimely departure from earth, has so affected my health that with others I can no longer hesitate to call myself an invalid.
America forever enshrined Lincoln as the principal martyr of the Union.
Just as we start with the Gettysburg Address, we have to conclude with Lincoln's greatest act, something that he would want to be remembered for above everything else, the Emancipation Proclamation. This is an original copy of what is called the Boker printed Emancipation Proclamation. This is signed by Lincoln, by Seward as Secretary of State, and by John Nicolai, the President's Secretary.
Like most Americans, Lincoln revered the Founding Fathers. He discussed their views on slavery at the Cooper Institute and referred to them in the opening of the Gettysburg Address. He spoke of Washington in his farewell address at Springfield, and again when he raised the flag at Independence Hall on Washington's birthday in 1861. He could not have anticipated how his name would soon be linked with that of the first president.
With the assassination, we here see what's called the apotheosis, the bonding together of Washington, founder of the country, with Lincoln, savior. This is George Washington's letter written from Philadelphia on his way to New York, discussing plans for his inauguration. The building on this site wasn't built until 1842. This is an engraving of what the original building looked like.
After the assassination, countless memorial objects appeared showing the two men, usually presenting Washington as the founder of our country and Lincoln as the savior of our country. The two remain our most revered presidents.
When George Washington arrived at this site for his inauguration, April 30th, 1789, he was met by young women all wearing sashes with his initials GW. This is the only known relic to remain of that so very important date in American history.
New York City is a particularly appropriate location for celebrating Abraham Lincoln, as it played a central role in each part of his story. He arrived here in February 1860 to deliver his career-making address at the Cooper Institute. He made New York a stop on his pre-inaugural tour to give several speeches. After his assassination, his body passed through New York City in a large funeral procession. Abraham Lincoln in New York humanizes this great man, a common man who reached levels of greatness without a formal education. A man with a predilection for storytelling and rather bawdy jokes. The exhibit highlights the writings of Lincoln, acknowledged master of the spoken word. These timeless statements are an enduring reflection of his leadership qualities and the commitment to the office of the presidency and the cause of the Union.